Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So today I'm going to talk about some simple steps that you can take in your own garden or outdoor space to prevent the spread or introduction of invasive species. And so I'll get right into it now as there's a lot to cover. So I thought it would be good to start just mentioning what we actually mean by invasive species. So what's the definition of an invasive species? So simply put, an invasive species is a plant, an animal, or a pathogen that is not native to Ireland, and it is either brought here on purpose or accidentally by people. So people have to bring them here, they don't arrive here on their own. And when they get here, they have the ability to establish and spread. And then once that happens, they can have negative impacts on wildlife, on the environment, and even on our economy. So our gardens host a rich variety of both native and non-native species. And some of these non-native species would have been planted in our gardens, while some others might have been accidentally introduced via the movement of plants or soil, or even the equipment that we're using in our gardens. And while most of these non-native species are harmless, some are considered invasive and they can take over, crowd out other species, and actually reduce biodiversity. And what's even more concerning is their ability to spread beyond our gardens into the wider landscape, where they can cause lasting damage to ecosystems and then to the species that depend on those ecosystems. So one example of an invasive species that many people would be familiar with is rhododendron, specifically Rhododendron ponticum. And this is one of Ireland's most damaging invasive species. It was originally introduced here as an ornamental plant to gardens in about the 18th century. And since then, it has become now widespread across the island. And we know that it outcompetes with our native species and it poses a significant threat to the health of our native woodlands, particularly our oak woodlands. So we know that it kind of forms these dense thickets that crowd out native plants, and it then just limits the access to light and other resources. It's also able to alter the soil chemistry, preventing the native plants from re-establishing, and it's a host to a pathogen which is responsible for sudden oak death, which is a disease in oak trees. And then cherry laurel is another really problematic invasive species, which is often planted as a border shrub in Irish gardens. And like rhododendron, it has also infested our native woodlands, where it is doing serious damage. So this is actually an unregulated species that is still widely sold across Ireland. There's currently a process underway to evaluate the risk associated with this plant. And then following that, that risk assessment will go forward for public consultation, and it's hoped that then the government can make a decision on whether to regulate this species. But I would say in the meantime that gardeners, property developers, even local authorities can all make the decision right now not to plant cherry laurel, because there's so many great alternatives. And why are we so concerned about cherry laurel is because, again, it outcompetes our native species. It suppresses the regeneration by forming thick stands, and it can even produce toxins which would deter herbivores like deer. So deer won't graze on cherry laurel, but they will graze on our native plants. So that gives the cherry laurel an advantage over our native species. So some people might not know that the nice bluebells at the end of their garden are actually the Spanish bluebell, which is another invasive species. And the Spanish bluebell can actually crossbreed with our native bluebells, creating a hybrid. And these hybrids actually threaten the genetic integrity of the native bluebell. And so both the Spanish bluebell and its hybrid are now displacing our native bluebells. and it spreads by seeds and also through underground runners, and often we see that it's spreading through garden waste. So when people are disposing of their garden waste, that's how it's getting moved around. So it can be quite tricky to tell the difference between the invasive Spanish bluebell, its hybrid, and then our native bluebell. So if we look at the Spanish bluebell there on the left, it's a much more upright plant, and the flowers then are broad bell-shaped that kind of flare at the ends, and they're arranged in a spiral pattern around the stem. And then the hybrid there in the middle is quite similar. Again, the flowers are spiraling around the stem. And then that contrasts with our native bluebell, where the flowers will be to one side of the stem, and it will actually droop over. So we do need to be careful when we're buying bluebells for our garden, any bulbs that we're buying, and to make sure that they are the native variety. I've heard stories, unfortunately, this year of where people had bought bulbs from Irish retailers that were advertised as native bluebell, but were in fact the Spanish bluebell. When they planted them and they emerged this year, they could tell that they were the Spanish bluebell. So we do need to take care when buying bulbs. Another invasive plant species that is associated with gardens is Himalayan balsam. So again, this was first introduced as an ornamental garden plant and has since spread by seed along our waterways. So now it's a riparian plant that we'll see along our rivers. And along in that environment, it can cause erosion, it can destabilize riverbanks and actually decrease plant and insect biodiversity. And we also see that it can actually change the fungal communities in the soil, therefore affecting biodiversity. So what are the actions that gardeners can take to stop the introduction and further spread of invasive species? Well, the first action is know what you grow. So we're asking people basically to get outside and get familiar with the plants that are already growing in your garden. So in the summer months, that's the best time of year to do this because it's much easier to identify plants when they're in flower. So I would say from April, May onwards, all the way through to September is a good time to go out and check what's growing in your garden. And you might want to check, are there any invasive species there? So to help you identify some of these invasives, you can hop onto our website, invasives.ie, where we have some identification guides, and we also have our regulated plant guide booklet, which is available to view for free on our website there. So they should help you identify any invasives that you might have in your garden. So then if you do decide to go ahead and add plants to your garden, there are a few steps that you can take. So you should be researching the plants before you buy them to make sure that they're suitable for your needs and also that they're easy to manage and dispose of afterwards. It goes without saying that you should avoid known invasive species, and it's always better to choose plants that are grown locally here in Ireland. Remember, when you're buying plants online, you can't see what they look like, so you can't see if they have any pests or diseases hiding in among the plants. So you need to take care if you do decide to buy plants online. And it would be very important that when you're abroad or on holidays that you don't bring home any plants or seeds or produce from abroad. And we would also say not to remove plants from the wild and plant them in your garden because that's another way that invasive species can spread. So as I was saying, we need to be cautious when buying plants in shops or online because we do know that invasive species, including some illegal invasive species, are still being sold in Ireland. Plants like Hottentot fig and the Spanish bluebells that I mentioned already have been found for sale here in Ireland. Enforcement of the legislation that we have is certainly needed, But as gardeners, we can take time to learn which species we should avoid and take care when buying plants as well. So to help people avoid buying invasive plants, we commissioned a guide of plants that you can use in place of invasives in parks and gardens. So this includes a list of both native and non-native species, but obviously native species are the best for biodiversity. But many of the ornamental plants that are listed in the guide can also provide food and shelter for wildlife. And the list is limited to plants that have been shown not to be invasive in our current climate conditions. And this guide will be available on our website very soon. So just to show you how it works, so the booklet is split into different sections like shrubs, hedging, ground cover, climbers, etc. And in each section, we give an example of a couple of invasive species, so some regulated invasives and some non-regulated invasives. And then we offer a range of alternatives that you can plant instead. So for example, instead of planting rhododendron, you could plant heather in your garden, which is a great plant for pollinators. So we often get asked if we should buy wildflower seed mixes, and the short answer is no, because wildflower seed mixes or seed bombs often contain non-native species, and studies have shown that the seeds in many of these wildflower packets are imported from other countries. They're not native to Ireland or of Irish origin, despite what the packet might say. And therefore, there's a significant risk if you plant these seeds that you will introduce invasive species or plant diseases. So what can you do instead? So instead, we recommend that you reduce mowing in your garden or leave bare areas to naturally regenerate. So simply by reducing mowing or removing the grass cuttings when you do mow, that actually lowers the soil fertility over time, and this helps the local wildflowers pop up. And these will be of much greater benefit to biodiversity than anything that you would find in a wildflower seed packet. So plants like dandelions, clovers, even bird's foot trefoil will naturally pop up after a year of reduced mowing and at no cost. So they and these common flowers, they provide nutrients that insects need. So it's a great alternative to using wildflower seeds. And you can check out pollinators.ie and the All Ireland Pollinator Plan for tons more actions you can take to help pollinators and biodiversity in your garden. So our second action is stop the spread. So we know that plants can spread out from our garden in a few different ways. So they can spread by seed, or they could spread from small fragments breaking off the plants and blowing in the wind, or they can often spread by the roots, so growing and spreading underground. So if you have plants in your garden that are likely to spread to the wider environment, there are some steps that you can take to prevent this from happening. So you should consider your planting location. For example, you can keep plants that spread by rhizomes, so rhizomes are underground stems, in containers to prevent them spreading. And it's also recommended that you would deadhead your shrubs often and then dispose of them carefully to stop them spreading on the wind. And this often has the added bonus of encouraging more flowers. It would also be important if you're trimming back any of your hedges or plants, that you would place a tarp or a sheet underneath that would catch any of the cuttings or fragments, and that those are collected and removed. It's always recommended that you would minimize digging around plants that are likely to spread as well, and just to take care when you're moving soil around your garden too. Because sometimes invasive species are spread unintentionally when people try to remove them. And it would be important also to cover all of your garden waste when you are moving it around to reduce the risk of fragments kind of flying off and then starting new infestations. So our third action for gardeners is compost with care. So careful and appropriate disposal of invasive plant material is important to ensure that we don't accidentally cause their spread beyond our gardens. And even when composted, many invasive plants can actually grow and establish from small fragments or seeds, even if they may appear to be dead. So never dispose of garden waste in the countryside. This is one way that invasive plants spread into the environment, and you could actually be breaking the law by doing that. Compost your plants. So home composting is an environmentally friendly thing to do, and the compost will benefit your garden. Do keep an eye out though for any regrowth in your compost heap and make sure that it's broken down properly before you use it. And alternatively, you can dispose of unwanted plants or roots or seeds in your brown waste bin. But you have to take care with regulated invasive species because there's different rules around that. So I'll come back to that a bit later. And if you can't compost at home, then you can get advice from your local waste collection company or recycling centre. And I would encourage people to check out mywaste.ie for more information on the services offered by recycling centres around Ireland, and also just to help you locate your nearest centre. So my colleague Colette O'Flynn has worked with the National Botanic Gardens to develop this new guide on composting invasive species. And what this guide does is it tells you which parts of the invasive plant can or cannot be composted. And you can find this resource on our website on invasives.ie. So this guidance basically refers to composting processes at home or on site that result in the breakdown over time of organic matter, resulting in the production of compost. And it does not apply to heaps of plant material that might be left to the side of your garden or to cold composting systems. So if you want to learn about the different types of composting, there's a handy guide there called Composting a Household Guide, which we will add to the link in the chat as well. So just if we take a closer look at some examples in the composting guide, so if we start there with tree-cornered garlic, also known as tree-cornered leek. So with this plant, if you're composting it, you can compost the green leaves and the stems, and you can also compost the flowers, but you can't compost the seeds and the bulbs. Then Hottentot fig, with this plant, you actually can't compost any part of it. And then our third option there, Mount Brescia, so you can compost the green vegetation, the flowers and the seeds, but not the bulbs or the roots. So our fourth action is all about making biosecurity part of your routine. So biosecurity simply means taking steps to prevent the introduction or spread of invasive species. And as a gardener, biosecurity is something you can do every day to help protect your garden and the wider environment. So to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species, always remember to check any plants or bulbs you have for any signs of invasive species or diseases. And ideally, you should be doing this before you purchase the plant. As we were saying before, don't bring any plants or seeds or flowers or vegetables from abroad, or order from overseas online sources. So avoid that if you can. And remember that you cannot examine plants that you purchase online for harmful diseases or invasive species. So it's definitely better if you can, if possible, buy your plants, your seeds, or any other plant products like compost from sources on the island of Ireland, and make sure that they are trusted sources. You should always be checking and cleaning and drying your boots and your pots and other equipment in your garden before you move them. And we would recommend that you follow the check, clean, dry code if you are working near water to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. So one very practical thing that everybody could do in their garden is set up a quarantine area so that you can monitor new plants that you're bringing into your garden for invasive species and for other pests. So the advice here would be to leave the new plants in the quarantine area for at least 2 weeks at a minimum, but longer than that if you can, and you can monitor them for pests and diseases before you plant them in the garden. And your quarantine area, it could be you could be a garden shed, or it could be an existing glass house that you have, or simply you could just set up a table like in the photo here and cover it with a net, so it doesn't have to be very expensive. So we do get a lot of questions about non-native invasive flatworms, and unfortunately these are becoming more of a widespread issue, and they're basically being introduced to our gardens via plants and growing media like compost and mulch. And there are currently 3 species that are regulated at a European level. So that will be the New Zealand flatworm and the Obama flatworm, and then also the New Guinea flatworm. And the first 2 that we have, the New Zealand flatworm and Obama flatworm, have been recorded here in Ireland, but the 3rd one there has not yet been seen here. So the New Zealand flatworm is probably the most commonly reported and widespread invasive flatworm in Ireland, and it can be very easily recognised. So it's kind of dark purple brown in colour on the top, and then underneath it's pale, and it has a smooth ribbon-like body. So unlike earthworms, the flatworms obviously have a flat body and they don't have segments. So that would be the key difference there. And then the New Zealand flatworm is actually pointed at the ends, and it would measure roughly 1 centimetre wide by 6 centimetres long. So you'll often find the species coiled up and covered in this kind of sticky mucus when it's at rest, and it actually produces eggs, and the egg capsules actually look a bit like blackcurrants, so you can watch out for those as well. And these flatworms are basically being spread through contaminated plants or soil. And then once established in a garden, they can prey on our native earthworms. And that obviously is going to have an impact on soil health and soil biodiversity. So we want to try and avoid these spreading further. So what should you do if you find a flatworm? So we have some steps here to kind of basically help to slow their spread and reduce the impact of flatworms. So the first thing you should be doing is make sure that you're examining any plants that you're bringing into your garden for flatworms. So you need to check the root ball of the plant, and you can check that for flatworms and their eggs. And just remember that the flatworm could be curled up, and so it can be difficult to spot. And then flatworms can also spread via compost and mulch, so do take care when you're introducing these products to your garden. And if you do find a flatworm, you can report it to the retailer or the source of where you got the plant or the compost, just to let them know as well, so that they can take action to stop further spread. And we would also ask that you would report sightings to us at the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So you can submit your sightings on invasives.ie, but please do submit a photo so that we can verify the identification of the flatworm. And you can actually monitor your garden for flatworms by checking under damp, dark spots, for example, under wood or stones or pots, because they do like to hide from the sunlight. And you can also set traps. So you can trap them by laying out black plastic, which would be held down by weights on the edge, and then just checking that often is recommended to check for flatworms. And then if you do find flatworms, you can also control them and their eggs by putting them into very hot or very salty water. Or alternatively, you can actually place them in a sealed container and put them into the freezer. And I would say you need to be careful if you are handling flatworms, and that you should be wearing gloves when inspecting them, because the mucus that covers their body can actually irritate our skin. So you need to take care when you're handling flatworms. So our fifth action is all about preventing invasive species escaping your garden pond. So we know that ponds can create wonderful features that can be enjoyed all year round and are obviously a haven for wildlife. So it's a great thing to have a pond for biodiversity in your garden. However, if they're not cared for properly, sometimes invasive plants can take over your pond, and then they could also become established in the wild. So one example of aquatic invasive species which may have escaped from a garden pond is curly waterweed, also known as Lagersyphon major. And this is a really damaging invasive plant. So it grows aggressively, impacting native aquatic plants and habitats, and it's obviously very costly to manage afterwards. So that picture on the left there, that's from Loch Corrib in Galway, where they've had a real issue with Lagersyphon major there, and they believe that it was introduced to the lake from a garden initially. Somebody had dumped the material into the lake. So to prevent the introduction or spread of invasive pond plants, always remember that you should, first of all, avoid planting or placing non-native plants in your pond, particularly if you're in an area near a wetland or a river. If you do spot any invasive species in your pond, you can remove them and try to do that as soon as possible. And the water from your pond, then you could use that to actually water on your lawn or in your garden plants. That's perfectly fine to do that, just once that you're away from any drains or natural water bodies. And then any plants that you're removing can also be placed as mulch into dry borders. And you can leave any plants that you're removing on the edge of the pond to drain for a few hours before disposing of them. And then hopefully that can help the wildlife then return to the pond once the invasive species has been removed. And it also goes without saying that you should never release any of your pond animals or fish into the wild, because this can be harmful for our native ecosystems, and it can be cruel for the pets themselves as well, because they don't do well in our climate. So if you cannot no longer care for a pet, make sure that you rehome it responsibly. So just get in touch with the authorities, and it can be rehomed. Because unfortunately, we do see people are discarding, terrapins, like the one seen here, the yellow belly slider, into our public parks and ponds, and it's just not nice for the animal itself. And they also can spread salmonella, so there's a health risk there too. And then there's some invasive animal species that can arrive into our gardens and cause problems. And then feeding or otherwise encouraging them can help them spread and actually increase the damage that they cause. So most people will be familiar with the grey squirrel. We know that it outcompetes our native red squirrel and can also spread squirrel pox, which will kill the red squirrel. And they've also been known to strip back the bark on trees. So they're a pest of trees as well. So that's another reason not to have grey squirrel around. So if you're in an area where they are coming into your garden, you should avoid feeding them. I know you can get special bird feeders that I think can exclude squirrels from feeding on those. So that's one thing to do. And then also we see now that in some of our urban centres, ring-necked parakeets have been seen and are actually becoming quite a nuisance. So these non-native birds, even though they're really nice to look at, can have an impact on our native birds by competing for food and for habitats. And they're actually a pest of fruit trees and are also very noisy. So if you have these coming into your garden, avoid feeding them. And just while we're talking about bird feeders, it'd be important that you always keep your bird feeders clean, and that you should check underneath your bird feeder to see if any of the seeds have started to sprout in the ground, because these could be imported and potentially could become invasive species here as well. So do take care with bird seed and your bird feeders. So we have been getting a lot of queries recently about buying ladybird larvae for your garden, and whether people should do that. And again, we would kind of say avoid doing that if you can, because there's a risk of introducing non-native species. If you want to see ladybirds in your garden, maybe you have an issue with aphids, the best thing to do is basically to encourage native vegetation in your garden, and then that will actually help our native species like that survive. We do have one invasive ladybird in Ireland known as the harlequin ladybird, and it's quite distinctive actually, and you'll see there as well the larvae is quite different to the native species. And if you do spot that, you can report it to us on invasives.ie again as well. So then we move on to managing invasive plants. So if you have any in your garden, you should consider managing them. And I'll just preface this by saying the National Biodiversity Data Centre is not an advisory body on management of invasive species, but we do try and give people some general advice and point people to relevant resources. But I will say with these invasive plants, no one size fits all when dealing with them, and the advice needs to be very species specific, and often the advice you need should be specific to your own site or garden to do it properly. So the first thing we would recommend is that if you are going about managing an invasive plant in your garden, just ensure that you have the correct identification before taking action. And if, again, you can go to our resources on invasives.ie or look at the regulated plant guide first. But if you're not sure, do send in a photo to us at invasives@biodiversityireland.ie, and we can help with identification. And it would be really important as well, if you are doing any management, that you would follow best practice guidance from reliable sources. So for those looking to manage invasive plants, there are some useful guidance documents available on invasives.ie. And you can also find good advice from the Royal Horticultural Society and also from the Property Care Association. But you just need to be aware that these guides may not take into account Irish legislation and laws around invasives. So you need to ensure that you're compliant with the legislation any action that you do take. And you can actually check out the webinar that we did last year for Invasive Species Week, which is available on our YouTube channel, where we did discuss some methods of dealing with invasive plants. And also it would be very important that you obtain any necessary licenses or permissions from relevant authorities before taking action. So for some of the regulated invasive plants, you do require a license from the National Parks and Wildlife Service to manage or move these species, well, particularly around moving them or transporting them. So that would be something to consider. So you can go onto their website there and see about the application process for that. I would always recommend, if you're trying to deal with invasive species, to go to an expert to seek professional advice, particularly for the tricky species like Japanese knotweed and giant hogweed that are particularly difficult to manage. And there's tons of professionals out there working now on managing invasive species. Unfortunately, we can't give recommendations of any individual company, but if you just go onto Google and do a search, you should be able to find some good companies there that can help you out. And when you're going about managing plants in your garden, it would be important to develop a site-specific plan. So you could do this with an expert. You need to consider things like, are you working near water? Are you trying to manage multiple invasive species? Could that invasive species actually be in the wider environment? And then is there a chance that your garden could become reinfested with that invasive plant after already dealing with it. And you could also consider collaborating with your neighbours, because sometimes we see these infestations do spread beyond the borders of our own garden. So it might be more effective and more cost effective to work with others when managing them. So for certain species, herbicides might be needed, but we would say that you should only use herbicides as a very last resort. The studies have shown that some of these herbicides actually impact pollinators when they get onto some of the non-target flowers. So you can imagine if you're spraying knotweed or something in your garden and you have a bunch of dandelions next to that, and then it accidentally spreads onto dandelions, like that's what we want to avoid happening. So you need to handle any herbicides you're using with care. And the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine has actually developed guidance on the use of pesticides for home use. And what they're saying there is, as I was saying, consider alternatives first. Always ask if chemical use is necessary. Are there other non-chemical options? So are there mechanical methods that you could use that would be effective? Obviously, only use approved products, and you need to be taking measures to prevent water contamination when you're using herbicides, and always read and follow the product label carefully. And then there's further guidance then available on pollinators.ie. So we have the pollinator friendly pesticide code. Again, only treat target areas. Spot treatment is much better than using blanket sprays, and always check the weather before you go out spraying to make sure that it's suitable. And obviously don't spray in flower rich areas to help our pollinators. So that guidance document there is available on pollinators.ie. And then our 8th action is don't grow trouble. So we know that certain invasive species are controlled under a law, which means that it's actually an offence to knowingly disperse them or allow them to spread or escape. And the management of invasive species is the responsibility of the landowner. So if it's in your garden, it is your responsibility to deal with it and not let it spread. If the invasive species is on public land, then that will be for the local authority to deal with. So you can report that to your local authority if there's things like Japanese knotweed growing along the roadside or in a public park. So it would be important that you stay informed and compliant with legislation on invasive species, because it is changing all the time. We are seeing updates nearly every year at this stage. And all the information about invasive species legislation is available on our website on invasives.ie if you want to learn more. And if you've gone through that and you still have some questions, you can then go to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which is the agency responsible for invasive species legislation in Ireland, and you can email biodiversitypolicy@npws.gov.ie. And we also are asking people to report their sightings of invasive species to us at the data centre to help us track their spread. So you can log your sightings through the web form on invasives.ie, and we ask that you include a good photo so that we can verify the identification. And then this data then is used to inform research, policy, and conservation. And we are also asking that you report any suspected sightings of Asian hornet in Ireland. And we have a new system for doing this called the Asian Hornet Reporter, which is a separate web form. And again, we ask that you include a photo because we can't follow up on anything unless we have verified that it is actually an Asian hornet. So you can use a web form, or you can access it through the Survey 123 app on your phone. So it's just, we're basically asking that people learn how to recognize the Asian hornet, but also where to report it. And the reason we're so concerned about Asian hornets is that they're highly efficient predators. So a single hornet can kill up to 50 honeybees in a day. And if the Asian hornet was to establish in Ireland, it could have devastating consequences for our native bees and other pollinators. And then that could have knock-on impacts for your garden as well. So just to help you recognize the Asian hornet, it generally is very dark in color. It does have one orange band across its abdomen and a long orange face. And it also has these kind of distinctive yellow tips on its legs, which is why it's also known as the yellow-legged hornet. But yeah, so it's kind of generally dark in color. And if we contrast that with our common wasp, which a lot of people get confused for the Asian hornet, that's much brighter in color. It's black and yellow. So we'll just go back to the hornet again there just to see the difference. So anything that you would see that's very black and yellow, that's not going to be a hornet. And the common wasp is also slightly smaller than the Asian hornet as well. And then also people get confused with the greater horntail wasp, which is actually a type of sawfly. And it has an ovipositor at the end, which people sometimes think is a stinger, but that's not a stinger, completely harmless. So you'll often see them kind of hanging around wood. If you're bringing any wood into your garden shed from outside, you might come across them. So people do confuse them for Asian hornet as well. So we have some new resources available on our website to help you identify both the Asian hornet and its nests, because the nests, people often confuse the Asian hornet nest for wasp nests as well. So those are up there. And for people who are maybe a bit more interested about Asian hornet, maybe you're a beekeeper, we have some new publications on the website about the response in 2025 and also about our new strategic approach should any Asian hornets arrive here in the future. And our final action is all about helping to spread our messages, spread the word. So preventing the introduction and spread of invasive species is a shared responsibility. And by sharing our guidance with your friends or your neighbours or your community and fellow gardeners, you can help raise awareness and encourage responsible gardening practices beyond your own garden and outdoor space. So we would love if you could spread the word and share the messages with your community and neighbours. Maybe you could discuss them with your local tidy towns or local biodiversity group, and you can even amplify our messages online via social media. That brings me on to Invasive Species Week. So this is our annual campaign to raise awareness of invasive species in Ireland. And this is taking place next week from next Monday. So organisations and groups from around Ireland are taking part and have arranged talks, practical workshops and opportunities for volunteers to tackle invasive species on the ground. So if you can't make it to any of the in-person events, there's lots of online talks happening as well. So we'd encourage you to join those if you want to learn more. And the full schedule of events is available on invasives.ie. So we're launching Invasive Species next week at Adara Heritage Centre next Monday morning. So the Meg Rivers Trust and Streamscapes have been running workshops throughout the summer, and they have another workshop on Monday morning in Adare on stopping the spread of invasive species. So if you are based in the Midwest, we'd love if you could join us next Monday morning, and we'll have some free resources there, including our new non-invasive plant alternative guide. And I just want to highlight some other events that my colleagues are taking part in. So next Wednesday evening, Colette O'Flynn is doing a webinar there on protecting your community from invasive species. So this will be for tidy town groups or local biodiversity groups who want to tackle invasive species. And that is being arranged in collaboration with Limerick City County Council. So that's next Wednesday evening at 7:30, another webinar. And then next Thursday morning, for any of you who are based in Dublin, my colleague Chantel is collaborating with Dublin Bay Biosphere and Clean Coast on a workshop there to train the community about invasive species, and that will be happening at North Bull Island Nature Reserve next Thursday morning. And then my colleague Anne is delivering a talk or a webinar on Asian hornets. This is being arranged in collaboration with the Irish Wildlife Trust. So that's next Thursday evening at 7. So for anyone who wants to learn more about the Asian hornet, but also about the actions that you can take to help. So that's a great opportunity there. And we have further resources available on our website. So all the advice that we mentioned here today will be available in a booklet soon, but there's just a summary leaflet right now up on our website. And also we have a playlist on our YouTube channel all about invasive species if you want to learn more. And yes, thanks basically for your attention today. If you have any queries for us, you can email us at invasives@biodiversityireland.ie. And obviously there's loads of information there on our website. So that's it. I'll now hand over to Rachel to see if we have some questions.
And thank you so much for anyone who submitted a question ahead of time. Hopefully a lot of them have been answered now through the presentation. But just to say, you mentioned kind of in the garden how the transport or moving invasive species if you're tackling them. We had a few questions come in relation to, I suppose, how do you stop or how do you prevent the spread of invasive species hitchhiking like on roadsides? Would you have any advice for that?
Yeah, so I think it would be important that if you are removing any plants that they're covered. So if you have a trailer or any kind of vehicle that you're transporting them in, that they are covered because they can blow away in the wind. So that would be important. You also see that sometimes people are cutting invasive species along the road, and that actually could spread them further, particularly something like Japanese knotweed. So it'd be very important not to do that. So yeah, that'd be one way to stop the spread.
Perfect. And we've got a few questions throughout the presentation as well. So thank you again, everyone. I suppose again, Kate, for us, our role with regards to invasive species and regulations. So there are some questions around regulations that I don't know if we necessarily can answer, but hopefully we'll be able to direct people to the right authority or organisations. So just one coming in about someone's neighbour is dumping their cuttings, like including rhododendron, into local SACs. So I suppose who could they report it to? And is there any signage that they can put up?
Yeah, so the SACs are special areas of conservation, and they're protected by law. So it's illegal actually to do that. And also rhododendron is a regulated species, so they should not be transporting it or dumping it anywhere. So they need to report that to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And they have a special section there on wildlife crime enforcement there, which you will find the details on their website. So that's the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So if you see anyone doing anything illegal related to wildlife or biodiversity, they are the agency that you should report that to.
Perfect, thank you. So someone asked, what's preventing a total ban on cherry laurel or any of the kind of more common garden centre plants like Spanish bluebell, etc.? And I suppose who's acting on that?
Yeah, so Spanish bluebell is already regulated, so it is illegal to plant that or to sell it. So anyone who's selling it shouldn't be doing that, and they are breaking the law. So if you think someone is breaking the law, you can report that to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. But with cherry laurel, it's not currently regulated. And as I was saying in my presentation, there is a risk assessment process underway, and they're looking at the risk associated with the plant. And then, as I was saying, that risk assessment will go up for public consultation when it's finished. And then following that public consultation, the Irish government, the state, will make a decision on whether to ban it. So it is a decision for the state to make. The National Biodiversity Data Centre is not involved in making that decision at all.
Just look through the other questions, and I think you might have just answered this with regards to the National Parks Wildlife Service. But I suppose is biosecurity mechanism supported by government regulations?
Yeah, so I guess biosecurity in our gardens is kind of our own responsibility. So the government wouldn't really be involved in checking to see if people are taking those actions in their own garden. Um, so I'm not aware of any like government level checks on biosecurity currently. But obviously it's very highly recommended, particularly if you're, working near waterways as well.
Yeah, perfect. And one about the Asian hornet, actually, and I think a really important question as well is someone asked, presumably policies that we should kill any Asian hornet if we get the chance before taking a photo. Could you
No, so
elaborate on
we would not recommend that. So we're not asking people to kill Asian hornets and we're not asking people to trap them because m most of the time it will be one of our native species and we don't want our native species to be impacted. So what you need to do is if you see what you think is an Asian hornet, take a photo and submit that through the Asian Hornet Reporter, but don't trap it and don't kill it. That's the key message there is we're not asking people to take any action. And then if it's verified as an Asian hornet, then the authorities will take action. So they will follow up with tracking down the nest if there is one. So don't take it into your own hands. We're simply asking people to take a photo and submit it through the Asian Hornet Reporter. So again, if you are submitting a sighting and you don't include a photo, we can verify that it is an Asian hornet, and then so there can't really be any follow up from there.
Perfect. I think what's really important there is like your safety will always come first. So,
Yes.
and that's to do with any invasive species like giant hogweed, for example, can have really bad health impacts as well, I believe. So always just assess before kind of doing anything regarding invasive species. So I see we actually have a few questions coming to the chat, so I'm just going to go through those. But I suppose there's, sorry as well, I'm just kind of flick through. Yeah, perfect. So is there anything we have to do to the soil after removing invasive plants? Like, can you add a native species instead?
I mean, I'm not like a technical expert on this, but I mean, I can imagine that if you're leaving areas bare after removing an invasive species, there it is susceptible for other plants coming in and then invading it. So I guess you could be proactive and actually maybe try and plant some native species in its place. But we do see when things like Himalayan balsam are removed, that the native vegetation actually does recover very quickly. So you might need to put anything in there, but there is a risk when anytime you have exposed bare ground that other invasives could take its place, for sure.
I can actually see in the chat that some people are giving advice on how to tackle the various routes as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your advice. It's really great that we can all come together on this. So we're just coming up to 1 o'clock now. And hopefully we've managed to answer everyone's questions. If you do have any other questions or queries, please feel free to get in contact with us at Invasives. Sorry, I'll actually leave Kate give the email out to make sure it's right.
Oh yes, our email is invasives@biodiversityireland.ie, and also we have a contact form on invasives.ie as well on the website.
Perfect. And I know there was a lot of resources today. They will all be included in the description under the YouTube channel as well, and hopefully flagged throughout the recording too. So I think we might leave it there. I just want to say thank you again to everyone for joining us today. And hopefully everyone can get out next week for Invasive Species Week and maybe attend some events or webinars and workshops. Perfect. Thanks a million, guys.